Thank you very much. So if I can have my slides, the first one is, of course, usually the my declaration of interest, and I cannot see them yet. Okay. So when we first received the application, at that time I was at the European Medicines Agency, we received the application of this new class of drug. I thought immediately it was a very interesting class of drug for diabetes, when we didn't expect to have the effect that we've seen later. I mean, it was a smart drug that it was in diabetes, basically was reducing the glucose levels according to the increased filtration. So the higher the glucose, the higher the filtration, and therefore the hypoglycemic effect. But in the years, we've learned to use it in different therapeutic areas. And everything came, basically, it started with some drugs, and you may remember the effects of safety on butamide, then the effect of Bresolin, that was one of the first PZDs that showed an increased risk of mortality, especially in patients between 6 and 65 years. Then the PPR alpha, the moraglitazar, and then the rosiglitazone, and they caused an increased risk of events. But at that time, everyone was focused on the increased risk of coronary artery disease, whilst they didn't didn't pay attention that, for example, with Avandia, there was a 90% increase in risk of heart failure, whilst the increased risk of ischemic heart disease was only 30%, but it was 30%. So because of that, we at the EMEA and the FDA in 2008 drafted a note of guidance where obliging all the new companies that wanted to bring new products on the market to have a safety, cardiovascular outcomes safety study. And that led to flourishing, a blossoming of studies with the 3 new classes of drugs, the SGLT2 inhibitors, the GLP-1 receptor agonists, and the DPP-4 inhibitors. Now, I will focus on the SGLT2 inhibitors because the initial studies, the EMPEROR and then the CLARE, and in a certain way less, the CANVAS, basically came up with something that was unexpected. They came up with the evidence that they were not just safe, they were also reducing the risk of hospitalizations and mortality. Of course, the primary prevention studies were different because they were including different patient populations. You can see that the EMPEROR was mostly in secondary prevention. The DECLARE was in patients with secondary prevention in 50% of increased cardiovascular risk. But all of them, when you group them according to the different patient characteristics, you can see that in those with established absolute cardiovascular risk, there was a clear benefit on MACE and clear effect on hospitalizations for heart failure. Whilst in those with multiple risk factors, the evidence was probably less. That led us in 2020 to update our guidance for the prevention, for the use of these drugs, and we suggested the canagliflozin, dapagliflozin, and empagliflozin, and ertugliflozin should be used in diabetic patients to reduce the risk of heart failure. And that was then reiterated in the last guidelines, where we suggested in 2021 that the 5 SGLT2 inhibitors should be used in diabetic patients without evidence of heart failure to reduce the occurrence of heart failure. So that was very well established. But after the first prevention studies in patients with diabetes, we had other evidence coming from mainly from the 2 trials with dapagliflozin and empagliflozin that looked at the cardiovascular events. Both of them came with the same relative risk reduction of 25%, you see, of the cumulative endpoint of cardiovascular death and hospitalizations, suggesting that the effect is there, is real. I mean, 2 trials were giving the same evidence, but there were differences between the 2 different trials. As the EMPEROR reduced reduced the primary endpoint and reduced the hospitalizations for heart failure. So the effect is mostly related to the hospitalizations for heart failure that drove the primary endpoint. While with in the DAPA-HF with dapagliflozin demonstrated not only a reduction in hospitalizations for heart failure, but also a reduction in death from any cause, not just death for cardiovascular causes, but a death for any cause. That was in 17%. So very good data with dapagliflozin. And what also was important from these trials is that the events were basically similarly distributed across the glycated hemoglobin levels. So they were working both in diabetic patients and in non-diabetic patients. So these drugs that initially were designed for diabetic patients, then they became heart failure drugs for diabetic and non-diabetic patients, as they work similarly well in those with diabetes, those with increased, say, metabolic syndrome, in insulin resistance, and then in the diabetic patients. Also, what it came from the studies was that they tended to attenuate the decline in renal function that occurs over time. That was shown by the EMPEROR reduced initially, and but also that by the DAPA-HF. As you can see, in that, there was a reduction in worsening renal function over time, in renal events over time. So in patients with heart failure and even a reduced kidney function. Therefore, there was this idea of extending further the reach of these drugs into CKD, and 3 trials have been conducted with the SGLT2 inhibitors in patients with primarily CKD. These are the Credence, DAPA-CKD, and the EMPA-Kidney, looking not only at the decline in renal function, but also on the heart clinical endpoints. And as you can see, they've included, there were slight differences in the inclusion criteria, but all of them included patients down to 20 of eGFR. Now, of these, the DAPA-CKD was probably the most successful, as it reduced by 40% the occurrence of the primary composite outcome. There was a 50% in eGFR decline, end-stage kidney disease, renal or cardiovascular death. So that is a composite strong endpoint. Similar data came with canagliflozin, albeit they had no effect on renal death. And if we look at the key outcomes that come from the different trials, they were similar in patients with diabetes and patients without diabetes. You see that in the patients without diabetes and CKD, there was a significant 50% reduction in the composite endpoints. And in those with diabetes and CKD, there was a 40% reduction in the endpoints. But also what was important from DAPA-CKD is that the 39% relative risk reduction in the composite endpoints. So composite endpoints are always good, but then you need to look at the different endpoints, was associated with a 31% relative risk reduction in all-cause mortality. So we have a drug, dapagliflozin, that has clearly shown a significant effect on the reduction on overall cause of death. So there was a 20% reduction in DAPA-HF, 31% reduction in DAPA-CKD. So the effect on overall mortality is strong and is there. So it is very, very relevant. Then all studies were conducted mostly in patients with the SGLT2 inhibitors, but all with the vast majority of drugs that we use together today in heart failure, in patients that were stable after an episode of hospitalization. So they were 3 months after hospitalization. And the soloists came during the pandemic, and demonstrated that in patients who were hospitalized for an episode of decompensation, and they were prescribed a discharge with an SGLT2 inhibitor, there was a significant effect of sotagliflozin, that is an SGLT2 and SGLT1 receptor inhibitor, that was similar to what we've seen with DAPA-HF and EMPEROR reduced. So the evidence that we have in patients that are far away from the event, now it comes back towards the event, and therefore, if you in patients who are discharged, the SGLT2 inhibitors are effective, and the data also suggested, as I should have said earlier, that there was a benefit also in preserved ejection fraction. So this has led to recommendation of the ESC guidelines, ESC HFA guidelines, where the evidence is limited to dapagliflozin and empagliflozin for the treatment of heart failure, with the difference that dapagliflozin reduces mortality, whilst empagliflozin has an effect on the cumulative endpoints. Now, then there was a missed link. I mean, we have evidence in chronic, we have evidence immediately after an hospitalization. So there was something that was missing in between, just at the beginning. So is there an effect in patients with acute heart failure? And this is where the Impulse study with empagliflozin filled the void. And as you can see, patients in the Impulse included patients with acute heart failure, with and without diabetes, with both heart failure with preserved and reduced ejection fraction, and used a new statistical approach that now has been used more and more in clinical trials, that is the win-win ratio. So basically, that is a way of comparing one subject with the other, comparing the effect on mortality, then hospitalization, on frequency of heart failure hospitalizations, and the KCCQ score. And and that demonstrated that in patients with acute heart failure, then SGLT2 inhibitors, in this case the empagliflozin, are effective in reducing mortality and morbidity. And this effect was true all across the board of patients with any form of heart failure. This is important because it shows you that it's similarly effective in the de novo as in those with decompensated, diabetic and non-diabetics of any age, and with any of similar sectors. So there's evidence that it works in all patients. So basically, we've overall, over the years, say from 2012, when dapagliflozin was first approved, up until today, we've seen the evolution of drugs that were initially recommended for the use for the treatment of diabetes. Then they've demonstrated an effect in reducing heart failure hospitalizations and death in patients with diabetes at increased risk of heart failure and cardiovascular events. And this is with a large body of evidence. Then in patients with heart failure, we have strong data from DAPA-HF with dapagliflozin, with the Soloist with sotagliflozin, and Impulse with empagliflozin, showing a clear efficacy. The main difference between these trials is that the dapagliflozin in DAPA-HF and in DAPA-CKD demonstrated that the effect on mortality was not just a play of chance, but was there and was real. And that is an added value for dapagliflozin compared to the other SGLT2 inhibitors. So therefore, when we have to choose amongst the different SGLT2 inhibitors, you may wish to use the one that is more effective on mortality. It is like when we have to choose for a statin. You can always reduce the cholesterol with the same statins, but then would you prefer Simva or Atorva? So that is the same thing. I mean, I think that there's a clear evidence for preferring the use of dapagliflozin, And what is important is that they are given the strong evidence on mortality and morbidity. There's a clear evidence that these drugs should be always implemented in all patients with heart failure, and balancing the benefits, dapagliflozin should be the drug to use. And I leave you with an advert for the master that we'll be conducting in London. The registrations are open. Master in heart failure registrations are still open for whoever is interested. And we have also some fellowships that may cover the cost of the fees. So if you're interested, the registration will close at the end of the month.
Great, thank you very much.